Eastern Front, winter 1943. The machine from hell. They called it Hitler's buzzsaw, but that name was almost kind. The MG-42 was not a weapon. It was a living thing, a creature born from steel, fire, and madness. The first time I pulled its trigger, I felt its hunger. It devoured everything before it, including the pieces of my soul that I didn't know could still burn. The sound. God. The sound. 1,200 rounds a minute, a shriek so violent it split the air and tore at the mind. It didn't sound like a machine, it sounded like a scream from the depths of hell itself. They said we were the most feared men on the Eastern Front. They said that when the Soviets heard the MG-42, they ran. But I didn't feel like something to be feared. I felt like a man standing behind the open jaws of a monster, hoping it didn't turn back on me. The weapon was fast, too fast, so efficient that time itself seemed to stutter while it fired. You couldn't count the shots. They came as one continuous roar, a stream of death that erased the line between single action and massacre. That morning, the snow fell silently across the trenches near Kharkov. The temperature was so low that our breath froze on our collars. My fingers were stiff, my face raw from the wind. We waited, staring at the fog that hung over the white fields. Somewhere beyond that veil, the Red Army was gathering. The sergeant paced behind us, muttering orders none of us needed to hear. We already knew what to do: aim low, conserve ammunition, fire in bursts. Though the MG-42 didn't believe in bursts, once it started, it didn't want to stop. When the first Soviet figures appeared through the mist, they didn't look human, just dark shapes moving through the snow. I loaded the belt of 7.92mm rounds, feeling the rattle of the links in my hands. My assistant gunner checked the spare barrels beside me, ready to swap them when the heat became too much. I could smell the oil on the receiver, sharp and metallic, mixed with the cold air. My heart pounded once, twice, then I pressed the trigger. The gun screamed, the world disappeared. The recoil jolted my shoulders, and a wave of heat rolled from the weapon. The snow in front of the muzzle melted instantly, steam rising like smoke from a grave. The Soviet line shattered. Men dropped, fell, crawled. Some disappeared in sprays of crimson mist that froze before it hit the ground. I didn't see faces, only motion, like shadows dissolving. The sound of the MG-42 drowned out everything. Commands, explosions, even my own heartbeat. There was only the gun, the vibration of the bipod biting into the frozen earth, and the endless metallic shriek that swallowed all thought. When the last belt clicked empty, the silence struck harder than the sound had. My hand shook as I replaced the barrel, the old one glowing dull orange in the cold light. My assistant hissed as he burned his glove against the metal. All around, the field was still again. Smoke drifted over the bodies, some twisted into shapes no man should die in. The sergeant shouted, "Efficient, very efficient." As if the word meant something good. Efficient, that's what they called us, but efficiency had no room for mercy. I looked at the weapon, its barrel steaming, the receiver spattered with blackened oil, and I hated it. Yet I also couldn't look away. It had saved my life. It had ended countless others. The MG-42 was perfect in every way that mattered on paper: lightweight, simple, unstoppable. And because it was perfect, it made monsters of those who used it. When the night came, the wind howled through the trenches. We huddled beneath torn canvas, too tired to speak. Somewhere beyond the lines, the wounded cried for hours, their voices fading into the snow. I tried to sleep, but even with my eyes closed, the sound of the gun lingered, that relentless, metallic roar, trapped inside my skull. My fingers twitched in my sleep, mimicking the trigger pull. I woke up gasping, half expecting to see the muzzle flash in front of me. They told us the MG-42 was the pride of German engineering. They were right, it never failed, but in its perfection lay its curse. It was the purest expression of what we had become: efficient, obedient, merciless. And as I sat there, staring into the frozen dark, I realized that the true weapon wasn't the gun at all. It was the man willing to keep pulling the trigger. That night, I understood. Hell didn't need fire, it only needed sound. And for the rest of my life, I would never escape it. Berlin, autumn 1942. The recruitment. They came for me on a gray morning, the kind where even the city seemed to be holding its breath. Berlin was quieter then, though the air already trembled with the distant hum of engines and the sharp, echo of boots on cobblestones. A black car stopped in front of our building, and 2 officers stepped out. Polished leather, steel insignias gleaming under the pale light. My mother froze in the doorway. My father straightened his back, proud but afraid. They called my name. "For the fatherland," they said. I was 20 years old. I believed in what they told me. That service was honor, that the Reich was strong, that we were chosen to shape a new world. They gave me a uniform that didn't fit and a promise that I would return a hero. My mother cried in silence as I left, her tears hidden behind the curtain. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. The training camp smelled of mud, oil, and sweat, the scent of transformation. The instructors shouted from dawn until the stars appeared. "You are not men," they said. "You are weapons." We learned to march, to clean rifles until our fingers bled, to shoot at silhouettes painted in red. Every word drilled into us was the same: obedience, discipline, efficiency. I absorbed it all, eager to prove my worth. I thought becoming a soldier meant becoming strong. I didn't yet understand that it meant learning to stop feeling. Then came the day they introduced the new machine gun, the MG-42. It rested on a table like some sacred relic, its long steel body gleaming beneath the fluorescent lamps. The instructor's voice changed when he spoke of it, as if he were describing something holy. "This," he said, running a gloved hand along the receiver, "is the future of warfare." German precision, German perfection. We gathered around it, a ring of young faces filled with awe. I remember the way the light caught on its smooth frame, the faint smell of oil and iron. My pulse quickened. I wanted to touch it, to feel its weight. When they finally let me hold it, I felt power course through my arms. Heavy, controlled, absolute. The weapon hummed faintly, as if alive. The instructor smiled. "You will become one with it. You will be its heart." At that moment, I believed him. That was my first sin. Our training became an obsession. We disassembled and reassembled the MG-42 blindfolded, until the sound of each part sliding into place was burned into our minds. We practiced barrel changes, ammunition feed, burst control. The gun demanded precision. One mistake, and it would punish you. The metal burned through gloves, the recoil bruised shoulders, but we didn't complain. We laughed, even, proud of the pain. Pain meant we were learning. One afternoon, they lined us up on the firing range. A long field stretched before us, filled with wooden dummies painted with crude red stars. "Remember," the sergeant barked, "these are your enemies. They are not men. They are numbers." When the first command came, the MG-42 roared to life. The world shattered into sound. The smell of cordite filled the air, smoke swirling around us. The vibration of the weapon traveled up my arms, through my chest, into my skull. The targets disappeared in splinters. The instructor laughed, shouting over the nose, "That is the sound of victory." But I remember lowering the weapon, my ears ringing, and staring at the broken dummies, something twisted in my stomach. For a brief moment, I imagined them breathing. Imagined blood where there was only sawdust. I shook the thought away. I was a soldier now. Soldiers don't imagine, soldiers obey. At night, in the barracks, we cleaned our weapons until they gleamed under the lantern light. The sound of brushes on steel was hypnotic. Some of the men whispered prayers before sleep. Others bragged about the medals they would earn. I lay awake, listening to the wind outside, the faint crackle of distant artillery tests. I couldn't stop thinking about the machine, how it had felt in my hands, how its rhythm had echoed inside my chest. They told us the MG-42 would make us invincible, but I began to suspect it would do something else. It would make us hollow. Each time I looked at it, I saw less of myself and more of the thing I was becoming. When the orders came to deploy east, toward the Russian front, the camp erupted with cheers. I remember packing my gear, strapping the gun across my back, feeling both pride and dread in equal measure. The train that took us away from Berlin smelled of smoke and iron, its windows fogged from the breath of hundreds of men who thought they were going to glory. As the city faded into the distance, I caught my reflection in the glass. For the first time, I didn't recognize the man looking back. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't alive either. He was something in between. The perfect soldier the Reich wanted. And behind him, faintly reflected in the same window, was the shape of the MG-42, silent, waiting, Eastern Front, winter 1943. The baptism of fire. The first battle came sooner than I expected. The snow had turned to slush, the sky hung low and gray, and the smell of diesel and fear filled the air. We'd reached the outskirts of Kharkov, a wasteland of frozen mud, shattered trees, and the wrecks of burned-out vehicles. The veterans told us to dig deep and stay low. The Russians were close. My hands were raw from the cold, but I clutched the MG-42 like a lifeline, its cold metal pressed against my chest. I had spent months training to use it. Now, for the first time, I would fire it at men who could fire back. At dawn, the artillery began. The earth convulsed under the weight of the shells. Each explosion sent a shock through my body, shaking loose the last fragments of courage I had left. The ground trembled as though the world itself was breaking apart. I remember the sound, a rolling thunder that never stopped, and the smell of the air, thick with smoke, canned mud, and something darker. Our officer shouted over the roar, his voice barely human. Positions. Machine gunners, ready. I crawled to the lip of our trench, the MG-42 resting on its bipod. Belt of ammunition fed through its side. My assistant gunner lay beside me, pale, clutching a box of spare belts and barrels. We couldn't see far, just the endless gray of the steppe, but we knew they were coming. The sound reached us first, the crunch of boots, the rumble of tanks, the haunting cries in Russian that echoed through the mist. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest. Then, through the fog, figures began to appear, hundreds of them, moving in a slow, deliberate wave. Soviet infantry, advancing through the snow with bayonets fixed. For a heartbeat, everything went silent in my head. Then instinct took over. I pressed the trigger. The MG-42 screamed to life. The world vanished in an eruption of fire and sound. The recoil bit into my shoulder as the barrel flashed brighter than the morning sun. The snow in front of us exploded into fountains of dirt and ice. The weapon didn't fire bullets. It spat out death itself, a stream so fast that no man could tell one shot from the next. The enemy line broke, but still they came. Wave after wave, stepping over their fallen comrades. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe, I only fired. The sergeant behind me shouted something. I couldn't hear it over the gun. My assistant reloaded the belt, his hands shaking. The barrel glowed red hot, the metal shimmering in the frozen air. Steam rose from the snow, where the casings fell, thousands of them piling up around my knees. My gloves stuck to the receiver, slick with oil and sweat. I wanted to stop. I wanted it all to stop. But the orders were clear. Keep firing. Always keep firing. When the barrel finally overheated, I shouted for a change. My assistant passed me a new one, but it burned through his glove, searing his hand. He screamed. I swapped it in any way. There was no time to think, no room for hesitation. The Soviets were only 50 meters away now. I could see their faces. Young, terrified, just like mine. I felt the machine tremble beneath me, its rhythm blending with my own pulse, until I couldn't tell where the gun ended and I began. The air stank of powder and blood. The battlefield had turned into a blur of gray smoke and falling snow. Bodies littered the field, frozen mid-motion. Somewhere to my left, a mortar round landed, throwing a man into the air like a rag doll. His scream was swallowed by the nose. I didn't flinch, I just kept firing. Then, suddenly, silence, the belt ran dry. I froze, my fingers still pressed to the trigger. The MG-42 clicked once, hollow and empty. For the first time since the battle began, I could hear myself breathing, ragged, uneven, human. My ears rang so violently that it felt like the sound was trapped inside me. The sergeant's voice came from far away, muffled and unreal. Efficient, he said, nodding. Very efficient, that word again. I looked across the field and saw what efficiency meant, a line of red stains in the snow, torn bodies scattered like discarded uniforms. I had done this, my hands, still trembling, had done this. That night, I sat in the trench, cleaning the MG-42 by lantern light. The metal gleamed, perfect, and feeling. My assistant's bandaged hand shook as he handed me the cleaning rod. Neither of us spoke. The silence pressed down like the weight of the sky. Somewhere in the darkness, the wounded cried for help, their voices fading into the cold wind. I stared at the weapon and thought of the instructor back in Berlin. His voice, his pride, His words about honor. There was no honor here, only efficiency, only the endless, mechanical rhythm of the MG-42, echoing in my skull. That was the day I learned what hell really sounded like. And from that day on, I would never know silence again. Eastern Front, winter 1943, the weight of efficiency. The MG-42 was everything the right promised it would be. Light, durable, perfect. It didn't jam, didn't hesitate, didn't forgive. It was the embodiment of German precision, a masterpiece of engineering. Yet, every time I carried it across the frozen fields, I felt like I was carrying a curse. The others called it the queen of the battlefield. I called it the thief of my sleep. After Kharkov, we became ghosts, our faces hollowed, our eyes darkened, our hands blistered from the heat of the gun. I had learned to change barrels faster than I could blink, to reload by instinct, to ignore the smell of burning flesh mixed with gunpowder. We no longer reacted to death, we measured it, calculated it, timed it. The MG-42 made that easy. One short burst could erase a dozen lives. 2 seconds of pressure on the trigger, and the world changed shape. The officers called it superior fire control, I called it damnation in small doses. I began to notice something unsettling. The gun didn't just obey. It demanded. Once it roared, it was hard to stop. My hands would tremble even after the battle ended, my fingers twitching as if still squeezing the trigger. When I closed my eyes, I could see the tracers cutting through the snow, could hear that metallic shriek that no silence could drown. We were ordered to hold a ridge outside Belgorod, overlooking a frozen river where Soviet patrols often crossed. The morning was quiet, almost beautiful. Frost clung to the trees like glass. The sky was pale, and for a brief moment, I thought peace might be possible. Then the radio crackled. Enemy movement. We opened fire before we even saw them. The MG-42 sang its mechanical hymn again, and the forest erupted into chaos. I saw branches snap, snow explode, shadows drop into stillness. Efficiency, always efficiency. My assistant shouted numbers, rounds spent, belts remaining, like an accountant tallying the cost of souls. When it was over, the snow was red and steaming. The lieutenant congratulated us. Perfect control, he said, but his words meant nothing. I stared at the barrel smoking beside me, at the hundreds of shell casings glinting in the snow. The machine didn't care who it killed. It didn't know mercy or guilt, only motion, only purpose. That night, I sat alone by the gun, unable to look away. I realized it was more human than any of us now, because it didn't choose. It simply did what it was made to do, and we, the men behind it, had become the same. They said the MG-42 gave us an advantage. They were wrong. It took everything from us, the ability to think, to feel, to question. It turned us into extensions of its mechanism, and as I cleaned it, under the pale moonlight, I understood the truth no instructor had ever told me. Perfection is the cruelest weapon of all. Eastern Front, winter 1943, the blind orders. By then, I had stopped asking why we fought. Questions had no place on the front. Orders came down like the snow, cold, unrelenting, and impossible to refuse. The officers told us that the Russians were not men, but beasts. They said mercy was weakness, compassion was treason. And after months in the trenches, surrounded by frost-tanned corpses, it became easier to believe them. When everything around you turns to ash, the mind will cling to any lie that helps it survive. Our company was stationed near a burned-out village north of Kursk. The ground was frozen solid, a graveyard of rusted helmets and shattered rifles. The snow hid the bodies, but not the smell. The officers walked the line, shouting slogans about duty and destiny, their voices empty echoes in the wind. We were told to prepare for another assault, to hold the ridge, to deny the Soviets any ground, to kill anything that moved. The MG-42 waited beside me, its barrel newly replaced, its steel gleaming even in the gray light. It looked beautiful, almost pure, a cruel deception. My assistant gunner, Otto, was barely 19. His hands shook when he loaded the belts, but his face was expressionless. We both had learned not to think. Thinking was dangerous. When the Soviets came that morning, they came in silence. A group of them crawled across the ice of the frozen river, their uniforms blending with the snow. Through the scope, I saw one of them stop, a man dragging another, wounded and bleeding, across the ice. His movements were desperate, clumsy, human. For a heartbeat, I hesitated. The lieutenant saw me pause. "Fire," he shouted. "They're animals. Don't waste time." My finger trembled on the trigger. I could see the wounded soldier's face now, pale, frightened, barely more than a boy. His comrade pulled him along, slipping and falling, but never letting go. They were not animals, they were men trying to survive, same as us. Still, the MG-42 roared. The scream of the gun tore through the air, and in an instant, they were gone, swallowed by the machine's fury. When the smoke cleared, the river was still. A stain spread slowly across the ice, dark and growing. The lieutenant patted my shoulder. "Good work. No hesitation next time," he smiled, as if it were something noble. That night, I sat in the trench, staring at the dark horizon. The wind howled across the steppe, carrying faint cries that might have been voices, or maybe just the echo of guilt. Otto said nothing, but I saw the way he avoided looking at me, the way his hands lingered on the MG-42 as if afraid it might wake again. I understood, then, that the machine wasn't the only thing without mercy. We had become just like it, cold, obedient, efficient. And the more we obeyed, the less human we became. By the time dawn broke, I no longer feared the enemy. I feared the silence that followed my own trigger pull. Eastern Front, winter 1943, snow and blood. The trench was a coffin carved into the ice. The walls dripped with melted frost, the air thick with the stench of sweat, oil, and something far worse. We lived knee-deep in mud that froze overnight and thawed by noon, a rhythm as cruel as the war itself. The MG-42 rested beside me, wrapped in a rag to keep the cold from biting the metal. I hated its silence almost as much as I hated its roar. Every morning, the same sound, distant artillery rolling across the horizon, a dull heartbeat that never stopped. Sometimes, when the shells fell closer, chunks of frozen soil rained into the trench, and we'd laugh. A hollow laugh, the kind that hides fear. The veterans didn't laugh. They just smoked, staring into nothing, their faces carved from stone. The battlefield around us was a colorless nightmare. Burned-out trucks and shattered helmets dotted the snow, like monuments to futility. When the wind shifted, it carried a scent that no man forgets, the sour, metallic odor of death, mixed with the acrid bite of gunpowder. The right called it glory, but to me, it was the smell of hell breathing. That afternoon, the wind picked up, howling through the ruins of a nearby farmhouse. The sergeant crawled down the trench, shouting orders through chapped lips. "Hold this position. No retreat. The Russians are regrouping." He didn't need to say more. We already knew what that meant. Another attack, another test of how long we could endure. When dusk came, the snow turned crimson. Tracer rounds lit the sky, a storm of red and orange streaks carving through the night. The MG-42 thundered beside me, its rhythm fast and merciless. Each time I pulled the trigger, the weapon kicked against my shoulder like a heartbeat from another world. Spent casings poured around my knees, clinking as they cooled in the snow. I couldn't see the enemy clearly, just shapes moving, collapsing, vanishing into the storm. My vision blurred from smoke and tears, though I told myself it was the wind. The barrel glowed again, white-hot in the darkness, until Otto swapped it with shaking hands. His fingers were cracked and bleeding, his eyes hollow. He didn't complain, none of us did. Complaining meant remembering we were still human. When the shooting stopped, silence fell like a punishment. The only sound was the hiss of cooling metal and the whisper of snow settling over the dead. I looked down the slope and saw the bodies, German and Soviet-alike, tangled together, their blood mingling in the ice. The sergeant called it a victory, I called it survival. Later, as I cleaned the gun, I caught my reflection in the dark metal. My face was smeared with soot, eyes sunken, unrecognizable. The man staring back at me wasn't a soldier anymore. He was something else, something shaped by cold, nose, and death. That night, I dreamt of the battlefield again, but without sound. Only the falling snow, covering everything in white, as if trying to erase what we had done. Eastern Front, winter 1943. The resupply. The worst part of the MG-42 wasn't when it fired. It was when it stopped. That silence between belts was unbearable. The noise had become a shield, a wall that kept my thoughts away. But when it ended, the quiet rushed in, heavy and suffocating, forcing me to remember what I had just done. Resupply days were the only moments that broke the rhythm of battle, but they brought no relief. We would drag the ammunition boxes through knee-deep snow, our breath freezing in clouds before our faces. Each belt was a snake of death, shiny brass scales glinting in the gray light. We carried them like offerings to a god we no longer believed in. The cold was merciless, our gloves stiffened into boards, and the wind sliced through our coats. Sometimes, the barrels cracked under the temperature, the metal shrieking when it touched the snow. The quartermaster barked at us to keep them warm, to treat them like our own lives. I remember thinking how absurd that was, as if the gun had more right to survive than the men who served it. We worked fast, our fingers numb, swapping barrels, cleaning the receiver, feeding fresh belts. The process was mechanical, almost sacred in its precision. One mistake, a loose link, a bit of ice in the chamber, and the weapon could jam, sealing our fate. I watched Otto handle the spare barrel with trembling hands, his burned palm wrapped in cloth. He winced every time he touched the hot steel, but he never stopped. No one ever stopped. That day, the wind carried distant artillery, a reminder that the Soviets were close. Every sound in the distance made us flinch. When the first mortar hit, it didn't explode nearby, but the vibration shook the trench like a living thing. Snow rained down from the edge above us. Otto looked up, his lips pale. "They'll come soon," he said quietly. I didn't answer. I just checked the gun again. The MG-42 gleamed under the faint light, cold and perfect, ready to devour whatever approached. I hated it, but I needed it. It was the only thing that still responded to my touch, the only constant left in a world dissolving into chaos. When the attack began, it came without warning. A rush of shouting and movement through the fog. I fired. The machine held again, its roar echoing across the frozen plain. The enemy fell, one after another, silhouettes erased by the muzzle flash. Otto fed the belts, smoke rising from the barrel like breath from a beast. Then the gun stopped, empty. For 2 seconds, maybe 3, everything froze. That silence again. Sharp, alive, unbearable. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the sting of the wind on my face. I realized, in that instant, that I feared quiet more than death. We reloaded. The roar began anew. That night, after the assault, I sat beside the weapon, steam rising from its barrel into the cold night. Otto was asleep, shivering under a torn blanket. I stared at the gun, black, glistening, motionless. It looked innocent, almost peaceful, but I knew better. The MG-42 didn't need to breathe to be alive. It had already taken ours. Eastern Front, winter 1943. The dead commissar. It happened on a day when the air was so still that even the snow seemed afraid to fall. We had been ordered to sweep through a ruined Soviet outpost at the edge of a forest, a collection of collapsed huts, burned wagons, and the frozen remains of men who had died long before we arrived. The silence was unnatural, like the land itself was holding its breath. I remember my boots crunching on the frost, the MG-42 hanging heavy on my shoulder, the cold pressing through every layer of my uniform. We moved cautiously between the ruins, rifles ready, nerves taut as wire. The sergeant's voice came in short whispers, "Check every building." No prisoners. Those words had become as common as the sound of gunfire. No prisoners. They called it an order. I called it the moment when a man's soul started to die. The first shot came from somewhere behind a broken wall, a desperate crack of a rifle that missed us by inches. The squad scattered, diving into cover. I dropped the MG-42 onto its bipod and swept the wall with fire. The weapon screamed, snow and splinters exploding into the air. When the sound faded, the only thing that moved was smoke. We advanced slowly. Behind the wall lay a man in a torn Soviet coat, his cap fallen beside him, a commissar. His pistol was still in his hand, but his eyes were wide, unblinking, reflecting the gray sky above. Then something moved, a shadow behind him. I spun the gun, ready to fire again. It wasn't another soldier. It was a young man, maybe 20, wearing no helmet, his uniform shredded, his hands raised high. He looked terrified, half-starved, his breath visible in the frozen air. He was trying to surrender. Before I could say a word, the sergeant's voice cut through the quiet. "Finish him." No prisoners. The words hung there, heavy and final. The Russian's lips moved, maybe pleading, maybe praying. I don't know, my hands trembled on the trigger. Otto stood beside me, silent, waiting. The cold seemed to press harder against my chest, as if the entire front was holding me down. I pulled the trigger. The MG-42 roared again, short and cruel. The Russian dropped without a sound. When the echo died, I felt nothing at first, no triumph, no relief, just a hollow space where something used to be. The sergeant clapped my shoulder. "That's how it's done," he said. I didn't answer. I couldn't. That night, I tried to wash the blood from my boots, but it clung to the leather like a curse. The water turned pink, then red, then froze in the basin. I stared at it for a long time. I told myself I had followed orders, that it wasn't my choice, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The trigger had been mine to pull, and from that day forward, no matter how many times I cleaned those boots, they never looked clean again. Eastern Front, winter 1943. The lie of victory. They said we were winning. The officers read reports aloud, maps covered in red arrows, words like advance, progress, success. They told us the Reich was unstoppable, that our sacrifices were building a new world. But when I looked around, I saw only graves. We held a stretch of frozen land that no one wanted, a wasteland littered with broken helmets, burned wagons, and bones half buried in the snow. Every morning, the sky was gray, the same dull color as our uniforms. The men didn't talk about victory anymore. They talked about warmth, about food, about home, though none of us remembered what home felt like. The MG-42 sat beside me, perfectly clean, perfectly ready. Its surface gleamed in the weak daylight, mocking the filth that covered everything else. The officers loved that machine. They called it the heart of our strength. But I had learned the truth. The MG-42 didn't fight for Germany. It fought for no one. It simply devoured whatever stood before it, indifferent to who fed it. After another assault, we buried what was left of the squad. The frozen ground was too hard to dig, so we laid the bodies in a shallow trench and covered them with snow. Otto muttered a prayer under his breath. I didn't. I had stopped believing in prayers. That night, our lieutenant gathered us around the fire and read from the latest dispatch. Heroic resistance on the Eastern Front. The Führer expresses his pride. His voice shook as he read, and I saw it, the flicker of doubt behind his eyes. Even he no longer believed the words. I looked at my hands, black with soot and grease. They trembled, though not from the cold. How many had I killed? How many faces had disappeared into the smoke without a name, without a thought? The reports called it efficiency, precision, discipline. But those were just words to hide the truth, that we were feeding the machine with our souls. The Reich wanted victory. But victory, I realized, was a lie, a story told to men like us so we'd keep pulling the trigger. And as the wind howled through the trench, carrying with it the faint smell of burning oil and flesh, I wondered if we had already lost long before the battle ever began. Eastern Front, winter 1943. Dubois' body. We entered the village at dawn. What was left of it? The houses were hollow shells, their roofs caved in, the walls black with soot. Smoke still rose from the ruins, drifting across the snow like ghosts. The silence was unnatural. No dogs, no voices, just the creak of our boots on the frozen ground. The air smelled of ash and decay, a scent that clung to the back of the throat. We moved carefully, rifles raised. The sergeant barked orders, his voice echoing between the ruined walls. Search for survivors. No hesitation, survivors. That word had lost all meaning. Every village we found was the same, burnt, empty, erased. Behind what once was a schoolhouse, I saw him. A small body lying beside a broken fence, half covered in snow. At first, I thought it was a doll, thrown aside in the chaos. Then I saw the face, pale, frozen, to still, a boy, no older than 13. His hand still clutched a small wooden pendant, a cross carved crudely from a branch. The sergeant stepped beside me, his breath fogging in the cold. Another one of them, he said flatly. An enemy less. He walked away without another glance. I knelt in the snow. Dubois' eyes were half open, staring into nothing. His coat was too large for him, patched and torn, his boots mismatched. He couldn't have been a soldier. Maybe he was running. Maybe he had just been in the wrong place when the shells came. The war didn't care about maybes, it only cared about bodies. For a long time, I couldn't move. The MG-42 hung heavy on my shoulder, its shadow falling over the child like a dark stain. I thought of Berlin, of my mother's voice, of the promises they made. Honor, glory, victory. None of those words fit here. Here, there was only silence and a wooden cross in a dead boy's hand. Otto called out from the street, "We have to move." I stood, forcing myself to look away. As we left the village, I didn't look back, but the image followed me. The stillness, the snow, the cross. That night, I dreamed of the boy's eyes, not accusing, not pleading, just empty. And I realized the truth I'd been trying to escape. Every trigger I pulled, every village we burned, brought us closer to becoming the monsters they warned us about. Eastern Front, winter 1944, the sound that never ends. Even when the guns stopped, they didn't stop inside me. The MG-42 had carved its rhythm into my mind, a relentless, mechanical scream that refused to fade. At night, when the wind was still, I could hear it. Not out there, not in the trenches, but inside my skull. Sometimes it was faint, a whisper of metal and echoing bursts. Other times, it roared so loud that I woke gasping for breath, my hands clutching at the empty air as if still gripping the trigger. The war had slowed that winter, but the silence brought no peace. We were stationed in a makeshift bunker near Poltava, surrounded by fields of frozen corpses half buried in snow. No one spoke much anymore. We existed between moments, between hunger and exhaustion, between fear and numbness. The only thing that kept me company was the hum in my ears, that unending reminder of the weapon that had owned me. When the others slept, I would sit alone beside the MG-42, its body dull and scratched, scarred by months of battle. I used to see it as a tool, an extension of my will. Now I saw it for what it truly was, a mirror, a reflection of the thing I had become. Sometimes, I caught myself mimicking its motion. My fingers twitched as if feeding an invisible belt into the chamber, my shoulder jerking with phantom recoil. The sergeant laughed once when he saw it. "You've got it in your blood now," he said. He was right. The machine had entered me. Not its steel, but its rhythm, its purpose. One morning, during a rare lull, Otto asked me if I ever thought about home. I said nothing. What was there to say? Home felt like another lifetime, a place that belonged to someone else. The only home I had now was the sound, the buzzing, the screaming, the endless vibration that filled every quiet space. As days passed, I began to wonder if silence was even real. Maybe it had died somewhere between the first and last burst I ever fired. Maybe the MG-42 had taken it with it, claiming it as another casualty. When I closed my eyes that night, I heard it again. The voice of the machine, faint but clear, a whisper of fire, a pulse of death. And I understood that no matter how the war ended, its song would never leave me. Eastern Front, spring 1944, the escape from the ideal. By spring, the snow had melted into a sea of mud that swallowed boots and dreams alike. The front was breaking apart, not in a single collapse, but in quiet pieces, like a machine coming undone. We still fought, still obeyed, but no one believed anymore. The slogans that once burned in our chests now sounded hollow, like echoes from a world that no longer existed. The officers insisted that the Fuhrer knew everything, that his plans were unfolding perfectly. But as the Red Army pressed closer and our supplies vanished, those words turned to ash in our mouths. One evening, as we huddled around a weak fire, Otto said, "If he knows what he's doing, why are we dying here for nothing?" No one answered. The silence was agreement enough. I began to dream of running, not desertion, just escape from the endless no's, the orders, the lies, but there was nowhere left to run. The east was fire, the west was retreat, and the Reich was nothing but a shadow spreading over graves. One night, I sat cleaning the MG-42 for the 1000th time. Its barrel was worn, its stock scarred, yet it still gleamed with a cruel beauty. I thought about the day I first held it, how proud I'd felt, how certain I'd been that this weapon made me part of something greater. Now I knew the truth. It hadn't made me part of anything, it had made me nothing. A corporal nearby whispered prayers for the Fuhrer. I almost pitied him. Belief was a kind of blindness, and I had once shared it. But after what I had seen, the dead villages, the hollow eyes of starving soldiers, the lies printed in every report, I could no longer pretend. The Reich didn't need faith, It needed bodies. We were just fuel for its dying fire. When I looked out across the black horizon that night, I thought I saw figures moving. Not Russians, not comrades, but memories. Faces of the men I'd killed, the friends I'd lost, the child in the snow. They stared back, silent, accusing. I turned away and shut my eyes, but the truth stayed with me. The Führer wasn't in the trenches. He was safe behind walls, while we drowned in his perfection. Eastern Front, summer 1944. The Russian counterattack. Hell came back with the thaw. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. Our trenches filled with mud and fear, and the horizon burned red again. Rumors spread that the Soviets were preparing a massive offensive. Whispers carried by prisoners, by intercepted radio, by the way the officers stopped looking us in the eyes. We didn't need to be told, we could feel it. At dawn, the first shells came. The sky tore open with thunder. The ground shook beneath us, as though the earth itself was trying to escape the war. The explosions didn't stop. Hundreds, thousands, a rain of fire that turned the world into dust and noise. I threw myself over the MG-42, clutching it like it could save me. Otto screamed something, but his voice vanished in the roar. Then came the infantry, waves of them, silhouettes rising from the smoke like shadows born of the earth. I opened fire. The MG-42 screamed back, its roar drowning everything. The tracers cut through the haze in bright, hateful streaks. Men fell, disappeared, replaced by more. The Soviets kept coming, endless and unstoppable, their shouts echoing across the field. The barrel glowed white-hot. Otto's hands were blister, bleeding as he swapped it for another. We fired until the ammunition belts ran dry, until the recoil bruised my shoulder raw. Around us, the line collapsed. The screams of wounded men mixed with the metallic hull of the gun. I no longer aimed. I simply fired into the smoke, at movement, at ghosts. A shell landed close. The blast threw me backward, dirt and blood filling my mouth. My ears rang. Not from the MG-42 this time, but from the explosion that had torn the trench apart. I looked around and saw bodies, friends, pieces of what had once been men. Otto was gone. His helmet lay beside the gun, half buried in mud. The Russians kept advancing. I crawled to the MG-42, hands shaking, and fired again, not out of duty, not even out of fear, but out of instinct. The machine screamed, and for a moment, I thought I was the one screaming. When the attack finally broke, I was still alive. But I knew then that none of us were fighting anymore. We were only trying to die last. Eastern Front, autumn 1944. The wounded soldier. The battle had ended, but the land still groaned. Smoke drifted low across the fields, mixing with the mist that rolled in from the river. Everywhere I looked, the ground was torn open, trenches filled with water and bodies, rifles half buried in mud. The silence was worse than the noise. It was the silence of exhaustion, of men who no longer care if the next shell fell on them. I moved among the ruins, the MG-42 hanging limp on my shoulder. Its weight a punishment. I could no longer sit down. My hands ached from days of fighting without rest, my boots soaked through with blood and water. I was looking for survivors, though I wasn't sure why. The line had broken, the company scattered. There was no front anymore, only chaos. That's when I saw him. A Soviet soldier, crawling through the mud toward what used to be a road. He was badly wounded, his leg shredded, one arm clutching his side. I raised my rifle out of instinct, but he didn't reach for his weapon. He just stopped and looked at me. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a strange calm. The look of a man who had already accepted death. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The wind carried the faint crackle of distant gunfire, the last heartbeat of a dying battle. Then he spoke, a rasping whisper in Russian I barely understood. One word repeated, Voda, water. I hesitated, then took the canteen from my belt, then knelt beside him. He drank slowly, trembling, his lips cracked and bleeding. When he finished, he looked up and said something else, quieter this time. I didn't know the words, but I caught the meaning. He pointed to me, then to himself, and said, Titos Zakliukani. You are also a prisoner. He smiled faintly, as if he pitied me. A moment later, he slumped back, his hand slipping from the canteen. His eyes stayed open, fixed on the gray sky. I sat there beside him, unable to move, For the first time in months, I felt something break inside me. Not fear, not anger, but understanding. He was right. We were both prisoners, not of nations, but of the same endless machine. And it had already claimed us long before we ever met. Germany, spring 1945. The surrender. When it ended, it didn't feel like victory or defeat, just emptiness. The front had dissolved into chaos, the Reich collapsing from within. I was captured near Magdeburg, thin, filthy, and half-deaf from years of gunfire. My MG-42 lay somewhere in the mud behind me, abandoned without ceremony. I didn't even look back. For the first time since the war began, I had nothing to carry, nothing to obey. Only silence. The Americans treated us with cold efficiency, not cruelty. They gave us rations, blankets, even cigarettes, though their eyes carried the same exhaustion as ours. In their camp, surrounded by barbed wire, I waited for judgment that never came. I was just another number among thousands of broken men, all of us pretending that we had simply followed orders, that obedience could wash away guilt. One morning, they loaded us into trucks. We didn't know where we were going until the smell hit us, an odor thick and sweet, like burning mixed with rot. Then we saw it, the camp, the one the Americans had liberated days before. The soldiers didn't speak, they just let us see. Rows of bodies lay beside the fences, skeletal and still. The ground was blackened from fire, the air heavy with ashes that clung to our clothes. I walked past them, numb, until I saw the faces, hollow, unrecognizable, yet human. One of the guards whispered, "This is what you fought for." I couldn't breathe. The world seemed to tilt, the ground dissolving beneath my feet. The images I'd carried from the front, the snow, the blood, the machine, all seemed small compared to what stood before me. This wasn't war, it was the truth behind it. I remembered the slogans, the parades, the promises of honor and strength. All lies, all leading here, to this place of silence and smoke. I felt the weight of every bullet I'd fired pressing down on my chest, each one part of a chain that had led to this horror. When they marched us away, I didn't resist. I was no longer a soldier, no longer a man with a purpose. Just another witness, forced to face the thing we had built with our obedience. That day, I stopped believing in sides. There were no victors left, only survivors. Germany, summer 1946. The inner trial. No one ever judged me. No court, no interrogator, no verdict. The Americans released me after months in a camp, saying I was low risk. I returned to what was left of Berlin, a city of ruins and ghosts, its bones still smoldering. The streets I had known were gone, replaced by hollow buildings and hollow people. The war had ended, but it still lived inside us. I found work moving rubble, one stone at a time, rebuilding walls that would never feel like home. At night, I slept in a room without windows. The sound of the MG-42 never left me. It was there in the hum of the wind, in the rhythm of falling bricks, in the silence between breaths. Sometimes, I woke drenched in sweat, hands clenched, hearing the endless scream of the gun. People spoke of justice, of rebuilding, of forgiveness. I said nothing. I didn't deserve forgiveness. My punishment came every night when I closed my eyes and saw the faces. The Russians in the snow, the boy by the fence, the commissar with his hands raised. They came to me in silence, never accusing, never speaking. That made it worse. Once, a neighbor asked me if I had been at the front. I nodded, and he smiled faintly, saying, "At least you fought for your country." I wanted to tell him the truth, that I hadn't fought for a country. I had fought for orders, for fear, for the machine that demanded obedience. I wanted to tell him that every burst of gunfire still echoed in my chest, that each night I counted the dead by the rhythm of my own heartbeat. But I didn't. I simply nodded again. I began keeping a piece of the MG-42, a small, rusted part one had found before leaving the camp. I don't know why I kept it. Perhaps as a reminder, perhaps as punishment. Sometimes I held it in my hand and stared at it until dawn. It was cold, lifeless, yet somehow heavier than anything I had ever carried in the war. No tribunal could ever weigh that piece of metal against the weight in my soul. The judges of Nuremberg would never call my name. My judgment came every night, when the silence began, and the sound returned. Germany, winter 1972. The silence that remained, I am an old man now. My hands tremble when I write, and my hearing is nearly gone. Though in truth, it was never the same after the war. The doctors call it damage from prolonged nose exposure. I call it the price of memory. Even after all these years, I still wake in the dark and listen for the sound that once ruled my life. Sometimes it comes softly, just a faint metallic whisper, like the ghost of the MG-42 breathing through the walls. The world moved on without us. Germany was rebuilt, divided, then rebuilt again. People speak of progress, of lessons learned. But every time I see a young soldier in uniform, I feel a chill. They look so certain, so proud, the same way I once looked before I understood what certainty can destroy. They remind me of a time when I believed that duty was the same as honor. I live alone now, in a small house at the edge of the forest. On the mantel above the stove sits the rusted fragment of that gown, the last piece I kept. Visitors think it's just scrap metal. They don't know it's my confession. I never cleaned it, never polished it. The rust eats at it slowly, the same way the past eats at me. I don't stop it. Some things deserve to decay. Sometimes, children from the village come to chop wood for me. They laugh, their voices light and free, and for a moment I almost believe that silence can heal. But when they leave, the quiet always returns, deep, heavy, absolute. And in that quiet, I hear the echoes again, the bursts, the screams, the orders shouted through smoke. People ask why I never remarried, why I never had children. I couldn't. I had no right to bring life into a world I helped break. My war didn't end in 1945. It still lives behind my eyes, in every dream, in every breath that reminds me I survived when better men didn't. Now, when I close my eyes, I no longer see battlefields, only faces. The Russians, the Germans, the boy in the snow. They fade slowly, carried away by the same silence I once feared. Maybe that is mercy. Maybe that is my surrender.